get confirmation. Yes. Okay, good. Secretary General, delegates, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the launch of the OECD's Pensions Outlook 2020. The Pensions Outlook is a biennial publication, and much has changed since the last release in 2018. COVID-19 has presented challenges to financial markets and to the real economy that are unprecedented in living memory. The crisis has presented some immediate challenges to pension schemes and retirement savings arrangements, including market turbulence and flow-on effects from low economic growth. Low interest rates and return on traditional assets has been so important in helping pension funds meet their liabilities in the past. In the face of these short-term challenges, however, we cannot forget that pension funds and their beneficiaries are by definition grounded to a long-term horizon. And here were already many headwinds before the coronavirus actually hit. And these include secular demographic trends and structural economic developments that will still be with us once the world has put this pandemic behind it. And actually, some of these have become compounded by the crisis. And this is exactly what we'll be covering today. And we'll unpack many of these issues in our roundtable later. But before that, I'd actually like to welcome the Secretary General of the OECD, Gurría, to our virtual stage to formally launch the OECD Pension Outlook for 2020. Secretary General, thank you for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Greg. And of course, I'd like to present to you this very handsome 2020 Pensions Outlook of the OECD. It's a traditional motif, you know, the nest egg with the three golden eggs. I think it says a lot, just a photo. It's a pleasure to be here to launch the 2020 OECD Pensions Outlook. Like much of the OECD's work, this report is a result of a collaborative effort between different units across the OECD, across the organization, and between the OECD Secretariat and delegates to the OECD Working Party on Private Pensions. And they are representatives of our member countries. I'd like to thank everyone involved. Now, this edition of the OECD Pensions Outlook discusses several ways to make retirement savings arrangements suitable, sustainable, and more resilient. Let me briefly outline the Outlook's main messages. The first of the messages relates to the retirement savings and pensions aspects of the policy response to COVID-19. Retirement savings and old age pension systems were facing major challenges before COVID-19 struck, notably because of population aging. People were living longer. Longer periods of retirement and the rise of the old age dependency ratio were already weighing heavily on both the private as well as the public retirement provisions. Further pressures arose from low income and low economic and wage growth, low returns in traditional asset classes, low interest rates have never been so low. All these are phenomena that together are linked to population aging and altogether make for a very complex context in which pensions are evolving. COVID-19 has compounded some of those challenges, and I'm sorry to say it has added new ones. Not only are economic growth, interest rates, and returns on assets likely to remain low for even longer than we thought before the pandemic. But the crisis is also increasing the risk that people may be unable to save for retirement at all. In addition, there are further challenges to be addressed, including the operational disruptions because of remote working, cyber attacks, which have multiplied, cyber frauds, cyber scams, or frauds and scams by themselves without being cyber, as well as calls on assets that are earmarked for retirement to support the economic recovery. Measures to provide short-term relief by granting people access to their retirement savings before they reach retirement age are likely to depress future retirement incomes. Now, the outlook, the pensions outlook, stresses that policymakers should balance the trade-offs between the short-term and long-term consequences of their responses to COVID-19. They should also ensure that people continue saving for retirement and avoid selling assets and materializing value losses when markets drop sharply. Allowing early access to retirement savings should be a last resort based on individual, exceptional circumstances. Assets earmarked for retirement can support the economic recovery while ensuring that these investments are in the best interest of members. The COVID-19 crisis has also underlined the importance of having long-term savings for emergencies. Introducing long-term savings arrangements that combine a savings account earmarked for retirement and a savings account for emergencies would make retirement savings more resilient. Now, the second message in our report is about assessing the adequacy of retirement income. Policymakers should have clear adequacy objectives and define what they want retirement income systems to achieve. They should conduct adequacy assessments regularly, identifying groups at risk and responding to their specific adequacy shortfalls. The third message is helping workers in non-standard forms of work to save for retirement. Now, the heterogeneity of these workers, which includes part-time, temporary employees, self-employed workers, informal workers, requires distinct approaches, specific approaches, depending on the case. Fourth is that addressing the potential negative consequences of frequent switching of investment strategies. What do we mean by that? Well, the possibility of switching strategies allows people to invest according to their own risk tolerance and their investment horizon. However, frequent trading typically results in lower returns. Policy interventions may be needed to discourage frequent switching. They could target individuals the design of the system, or potential external influences like misleading advice. Now, the fifth message is take care in the design of risk-sharing arrangements. Now, risk-sharing either between the provider and the participants or solely among the participants themselves increases a collective capacity to invest in higher risk assets that can provide a higher expected retirement income. So it's a fine objective. However, risk sharing needs to be designed so that it is sustainable and that it promotes fairness among participants. And last but not least, improve communication to help people choose among investment strategies. Now, the experiences of different countries suggest that consistent and standardized communication is helpful. Communication about investment strategies, their associated risks, their rewards, their costs. All that needs to be adapted to the target audience. And then we should not couch it in specialized jargon or very complex metrics. We should make it understandable. So, dear friends, retirement savings and pension systems were already facing daunting challenges before COVID. And as we said before, the crisis has only added to these challenges. Rest assured, however, that as we respond to the crisis and as we build back better together, the OECD will continue to work with you and for you to ensure that retirement saving arrangements are sustainable, more resilient. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, SG. Pablo, I think we move on to our panel. Pablo.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Secretary General. Thank you, Greg. As part of the launch of the Pension Outlook, we have scheduled a panel in which we have 3 speakers that I'm very proud to present here today. First, we have Greg Medcraft, which is the Director for the Financial and Enterprise Affairs at the OECD. We have second Helen Rowell, Deputy Chair of the Australian Prudential Regulatory Authority, APRA, and President of the International Organization of Pension Supervisors. Welcome, Helen. I also have the pleasure of introducing Eric Pan, which is President and CEO of the Investment Company Institute. Welcome, Eric. And Olivia Mitchell, Executive Directors of the Pension Research Council in Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania. As I say, I'm very pleased to have these distinguished speakers here with us today. And we are going to have a discussion about some of the issues that the Secretary General has highlighted, and also some of the issues that the speakers are interested that we address. And I will start asking a question to Greg. As you say at the beginning of the presentation on the introduction of the Secretary General, the role of the Pensions Outlook, and it's quite important in its contribution to improve retirement savings. Can you highlight a little bit more this role of the Pension Outlooks and retirement savings, please?
Yeah, thanks, Pablo. Well, I want to start, if you first, by taking a step back to look at the context that produced this edition of the OECD Pension Outlook, and then second, to look at the specific goals of this year's edition. I think first, as the Secretary General said, it's the result of very close collaboration between the pension and insurance regulators and supervisors from OECD and non-OECD countries through the OECD Working Party on Private Pensions, and many of those delegates have joined us today with the International Organisation of Pension Supervisors, and we're lucky again to have Helen joining us in the discussion, bringing the IOPS perspective. The Working Party on Private Pensions, as we know, is a forum where countries do come together to share knowledge and intelligence and experience in retirement savings arrangements. And what we're seeing today is, and in recent history, is that many countries are facing similar challenges. Many countries inside and outside the OECD are dealing with secular demographic trends like aging populations that have more people entering retirement and less people entering the workforce. We have improved longevity, which of course is a good thing, but also means we need to fund retirements for longer. But also we're facing structural economics trends such as low productivity growth, I mentioned before, stagnant wage growth. We've got a rise in non-standard forms of work, low interest rates, and related low return on traditional asset classes. And then over the past year, retirement savings and old age pension systems and their regulators and supervisors have had to contend with the impacts of COVID-19, which has really just exacerbated and extended some of these trends and brought really new challenges. So I think the OECD, what we do is we bring countries together to examine and analyse these experiences and to draw from them the advice and the guidance to policymakers on how best to make resilient savings arrangements more sustainable and more resilient. And as the Secretary General just highlighted, the kind of policy options and guidance we develop are about making trade-offs between the time horizons and competing policy objectives. They also need to take into account the institutional setup and the goals of each country. And that brings me to the goal of this edition of the OECD Pension Outlook. And more than anything, that goal is to help policymakers strike the right balance as they navigate the immediate crisis before us, while ensuring the needs of retirement savers are met in the years, many years into the future. Pension supervisors and policymakers must, of course, act to ensure integrity and sustainability and adequacy of pension systems and arrangements through the pandemic, but we can't actually let that distract us from meeting the long-term goals and addressing the long-term challenges that I've mentioned previously. And I think we also want to make sure that it doesn't divert us from the fact that retirement savings arrangements around the world do need to be improved if they're going to fulfill the essential role of providing retirement incomes, either as a main source of retirement income or as a complement to pay-as-you-go pension schemes, depending on the country. So this outlook does offer advice on how policymakers can appropriately leverage retirement assets to support the economic recovery and resilience, to encourage retirement savings through difficult economic conditions and meet the short-term challenges arising from the crisis. And at the same time, it does put forward options and analysis to adapt and strengthen retirement savings arrangements in the face of those long-term shifts like sharing longevity risk and supporting individuals in non-standard work. So all of this, I think, is again put forward to help pension regulators and supervisors stay the course in rough seas. They are rough, and to keep an eye on the destination. That is sustainable, resilient, and fit for purpose pensions and saving systems that provide for our citizens in retirement.
Thank you very much, Greg. So if I may, I will highlight a few sentences of what you just say. So the key message is sharing experiences to learn from each other, that it's important. I'm glad to hear that. Advice, that's the purpose, to provide advice, and to provide advice on regulatory issues, but also on supervisory issues. And I'm glad now that we have Helen here as the president or chair of the president of the IOPS, the International Organization of Pension Supervisors, because that links perfectly. So what is the view from the point of view of supervisors as regard making retirement savings more sustainable and more resilient, in particularly in the context of COVID-19, but also what has highlighted that the pension system has been facing other challenges for some time. So Helen, please.
Thank you, Pablo, and hello, everyone, wherever you are and whatever time of day it may be for you. It's a pleasure to participate in the launch of the OECD Pensions Outlook 2020. And I'd like to congratulate everyone that's been involved in its development, because it really does provide a comprehensive overview of a number of the key policy issues and supervisory issues many jurisdictions are facing, and a useful guide for all jurisdictions to consider as they evolve their own pension systems. So as others have said already, the COVID-19 pandemic has had and continues to have a serious impact on the global economy and financial systems, with significant implications for retirement systems around the world. And earlier this year, IOPS gathered information on the impact of COVID-19 on private pension systems and pension supervision through a survey of its membership. And we released the IOPS statement on COVID-19 supervisory measures in late May. And then in June 2020, we had a roundtable discussion at our virtual meeting with almost 200 participants to discuss some of the solutions that policymakers and supervisors have implemented in their jurisdictions. And we've also just recently had our November meeting where we've refocused our attention and are planning the work we need to do in 2021 to build on the conversations and the learnings that we've had to date. And clearly, a lot of the key pension system and member impacts that have been identified by IOPS members within their jurisdictions are also covered in the Pension Outlook. And as Greg noted in his opening comments, that includes the adverse impacts on pension outcomes. So whether that's the decline in the value of pension investments in defined contribution balances, or impacting adversely the funding position of defined benefit funds. There have been increased liquidity and counterparty and transactional and sequencing risks across pension systems. There's been significant operational disruptions for pension organisations and their service providers because they've had to fundamentally change the way they operate in response to health aspects of the crisis. And that's created the potential for material risks to their operations and the delivery of services to members. And of course, it's also been disruptive for supervisors in overseeing the operations of the pension systems. And as was noted in the Secretary-General's opening comments, of course, the risk of scams and frauds and cyber attacks in this environment is significantly heightened, and we've seen evidence of that in a number of jurisdictions. And all of those risks and impacts have the potential to reduce retirement outcomes, but also importantly, potentially the level of trust and confidence that members have in their pension systems. And so what we've seen in response across jurisdictions around the world has been a concerted collective effort by all of the stakeholders in the system, the governments, the central banks, the legislators, the prudential and conduct regulators, the trustees, the service providers and other agents to manage and mitigate all of those impacts to the extent that they can. From the work we've done and the lessons we've shared through IOPS, the key learnings that we've identified from a supervisory perspective have been the importance of clear communication and guidance by supervisors to all stakeholders to promote informed decision-making and understanding of the consequences of actions and decisions, the value of robust contingency planning and stress and scenario analysis, ideally ahead of the crisis, but also during the crisis and being able to adapt and evolve. And that needs to be supported by access to timely and accurate data so that that analysis can guide the responses to emerging risks by governments, by supervisors and the industry. It's also highlighted the relevance of regulatory flexibility so that entities within the system can maintain their business operations and continuity and focus on the issues at hand, but also needing to ensure that entities maintain sound operational, financial and risk management to deliver the benefits and the services to their members. And it's also highlighted, again, and this has been touched on already, the importance of having options for pension systems to assist in addressing financial hardship, including through temporary measures to enable access to funds from pension accounts. But that needs to be balanced with longer term considerations, in particular given the important role of pension systems in the delivery of strong retirement outcomes in the future, and also the role it needs to play in the economic recovery itself. So in Australia, as an example, we collaborated very closely with our peer regulatory agencies, and we very much recalibrated our supervisory focus and intensified our supervision on some of the key risk areas that have been brought about by COVID-19. And that included a significant focus on liquidity pressures brought about by members switching to cash, the foreign exchange cash calls that funds needed to meet, the reduction in the levels of contributions impacting cash flow, a number of funds with high levels of illiquid assets that potentially needed to be realised and revalued, and we had an expanded early release scheme that enabled members in financial hardship to access some of their retirement balances. All of those factors placed pressure on liquidity that needed to be managed, and so we as supervisors needed to be in there and engaging with trustees to make sure they were managing those well. There were a number of other investment-related matters that we had to deal with as a supervisor, and that included focusing on how trustees were revaluing unlisted assets given the market volatility, how they were looking at and managing the impact on returns and outcomes of the crystallisation of investment losses for members that did switch or where they needed to realise illiquid investments to meet cash or liquidity needs. A focus on ensuring trustees were rebalancing to strategic asset allocations and monitoring any shifts in investment strategies and the level of risks being undertaken to maintain equity across members and ensure that funds were remaining as true to label as they could be in this uncertain and changing environment. And all of that and the heightened risk is particularly important given the economic and long-term low interest rate environment that we're seeing with continuing market volatility, which means investment-related risks are very much heightened at the moment. The operational and processing matters that I've already touched on were a key focus for us, particularly in that environment of significantly higher volumes of member activity. And we also had issues of fund sustainability in a period of ongoing volatility, and that was particularly the case for funds that had already been underperforming or facing sustainability concerns prior to COVID. So our core focus through all of that was on ensuring trustees were delivering good outcomes for their members as best as they could through this changing environment, and that's been central to our approach. In Australia, we are seeing a gradual shift back to a more normal operating environment and conditions and reduced financial market stress, which means we're starting to return more to a business as usual supervision approach and expectations. But significant uncertainty in the outlook does remain, and so there's no room for complacency in Australia or in any jurisdiction as we navigate what lies ahead. Thanks, Pablo.
Thank you very much, Helen. Honestly, it's good, at least from my part, it's good to hear that you supervisors are there because you're doing a lot of work. And as you highlight, trust is a very important issue. Thank you very much. If I may, well, you mentioned issues like communication, guidance, and explain what is being done. As we highlight in the Pension Outlook on Chapter 7, we focus more on investment strategies. This communication is a very important issue, so I completely agree. As the Secretary General and Greg highlighted, COVID-19 have brought new challenges, and you highlight these operational disruptions of the different players in pensions, and it's interesting to see that contingency planning and timely data, as you highlight, and also regulatory flexibility to allow for business operation continuity are the main messages. We believe so at the OECD Working Party on Private Pensions, and we also highlight this in the publication on retirement savings and COVID-19. And you also were talking a little bit about investment issues. I'm not going to say much, but we now have Eric from ICI, and we are going to, I believe, to talk a little bit about investment issues. So The question I have for Eric is, well, how important is this issue of building retirement savings and have assets earmarked for retirement? And what is the role of the industry in managing these assets? Could you please give us your point of view on this?
Sure. Well, first of all, I just want to thank the OECD for organizing this roundtable, and also to say what a pleasure it is to be with Helen, with Olivia, with Greg, and with you, Pablo, here today. So let me start off. My first observation is that if you're going to have an effective retirement system, you need complementary sources of funding. And what I mean by that is a combination of pay-as-you-go programs and funded pensions. So taking the U.S. experience as an example, the United States has a retirement system that has both of these sources of funding. We have U.S. government programs that are pay-as-you-go, the most famous of which is the Social Security system, which is a mandatory pension system funded through payroll taxes. But in addition, we also have a cash welfare program for the elderly, which is funded through general tax revenue. So it's important to note that the Social Security system is not a welfare program. So the Secretary General talked about adequacy of retirement savings. Social Security doesn't seek to achieve a certain level, but Social Security, funded through a payroll tax that people pay throughout their working lifetime, provides continuity of income into their retirement years. And about 93% of Americans participate in the Social Security system. Now, on top of these government programs, we have the funded pensions. And this includes the voluntary employer-sponsored retirement plans, as well as individual retirement accounts, or what we call IRAs. Now, employer-sponsored plans can be both defined benefit or defined contribution, but they're always voluntary. Employers do not have to offer the plans, and employees do not have to participate in the plans. But the fact is, most employers do offer, and most employees do participate, because from the employer's perspective, this is actually a very important part of attracting workers and as a form of compensation. And for employees, they get tax incentives to participate in these plans. My second observation goes to how these programs are funded. Now, pay-as-you-go can be an appropriate design for mandatory government pensions, but because of demographic changes, many pay-as-you-go programs around the world do not have sufficient revenue to pay for promised benefits. And so, in the United States, for example, ICI believes that it's really important that we place the U.S. Social Security system on a firm financial footing. This is something that our government will need to work on in the coming years. And we note that other countries, such as Sweden, for example, have already changed their pay-as-you-go systems in order to account for changing demographics as well as changing economic conditions. Defined benefit plans can be fully funded, but the U.S. experience has been that defined benefit plans usually are not fully funded. And defined contribution plans, of course, by definition, are always fully funded. And so in the United States, defined contribution plans have really come to dominate the U.S. private sector. They happen to be very well suited for an economy where workers tend to change jobs quite often, as it is the case in the United States. And workers like defined contribution plans because they get to own the assets, they get to take them with them when they go from one employer to the other, and they like to have the control that defined contribution plans offer. They get to choose different types of investment options and how they access those assets once they do retire. My third observation is that in the United States, this combination of pay-as-you-go as well as voluntary funded pensions has actually worked quite well. About 75% of near retiree households in the United States have benefits in employee-sponsored retirement plans, either defined benefit or defined contribution plans or IRAs. And the fact is that more retirees are receiving more retirement income than they did before. So if we look at 1975 as a baseline, about 1/3 of retirees had income from voluntary contribution plans. And if we were to measure it in 2015 dollars, they got about $9,700. Now, if you go to 2015, 2/3 of retirees are getting these funds, and the amount that they're actually getting from income is about $20,000. So there has been improvement over those years. You also, I want to touch upon something that was raised also by the SG and some of the other comments, which is, so what is the role of these savings when it comes to things like capital markets development? Here, I think the relationship is quite simple and direct. The fact that we encourage retirees or workers, that is, to save for retirement through IRAs, through employer-sponsored plans, also creates an important source of capital for companies and makes the capital markets even more vibrant. And here, I just want to conclude my remarks by saying, in the United States, about $9.6 trillion is in mutual funds, where these are funds that are investing in the US capital markets, as well as capital markets around the world. And when you compare the United States with, for example, the EU, where in the EU households hold about 30% of their financial assets in bank deposits or currencies, whereas in the United States, only 12% are in bank deposits, whereas 22% are in regulated funds. As other jurisdictions, like in Europe, start thinking about how they can spur capital market development, closing that gap would be really important.
Thank you very much, Eric. So if I may, you argue, which we completely agree with the OECD, that it's important to balance the different sources to finance retirement. So I'm very glad that you make that point, because that has been an important point of the OECD. It's important to have pay-as-you-go and retirement savings to balance and to complement each other. On the role of retirement savings, well, those numbers are quite amazing, the ones that you highlighted for the US and the EU. But the main message is that they help to deepen and create capital markets. This is one of the issues that we expect to be working a lot in the Working Party on Private Pensions in the coming year. And let me now move to Olivia, and I'm glad to have Olivia here with us as well. And Olivia is a researcher and an expert on retirement savings arrangements. And given the main theme of the OECD Pensions Outlook on making retirement saving arrangements sustainable and more resilient, and what we have learned and experienced from COVID-19, but also the challenges of aging and low growth that they were facing before. Olivia, which issues do you think are more important for policymakers to focus on, given your research experience, in order to improve the sustainability and the resilience of these systems? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for including me in this wonderful event. And thank you particularly, Pablo, for asking me to participate. It's a pleasure to be here, and I congratulate the team on this very impressive volume, particularly the first chapter on COVID and pensions, which is top of mind for all of us in this day and age. The weaknesses identified by Secretary General Gurría and by Director Medcraft have really gone from bad to worse in the pension system with the COVID pandemic. So even though a vaccine, or perhaps several, are now in the offing, I believe that the fallout from COVID will take years to overcome due to resulting high unemployment, many business failures, long-term health complications, shortfalls in government revenue, and much more, unfortunately. This is why they call economics the dismal science, I'm afraid. But against this backdrop, what must governments and plan sponsors do to rebuild the world's pension systems? Just to start the discussion, I have 3 top recommendations. First, I heartily agree with the Pensions Outlook team that those charged with managing pensions must commit to the perception and the reality that pensions exist to provide retirement security. This should be a first premise to all of us charged with managing pensions However, during the pandemic, some governments, including the US government and many Latin American nations, have allowed workers to cash out some or all of their pension assets, some of them more than once. I think it's very dangerous to permit pensions to borrow from or withdraw their pension assets permanently, and it should be halted as soon as possible. Not only is it prejudicial to workers' future retirement plans, but it sets a precedent, and I am concerned we may never be able to go back to protect pension assets. Second, pension assets should not be used, in my view, to support failing businesses or to seek to revitalize some economic sectors over others. And the job of a pension is to collect contributions, invest them in the capital market at fair prices, which recognize risk and pay benefits, not to try to do what politicians deem beneficial. But we've seen to date that some nations have directed that pension assets be used to support failing businesses. Now, unfortunately, we still do not know the full extent of the pandemic's damage, nor do we know whether and when labor and capital markets will return to strength. Accordingly, in my view, using political criteria to guide pension investments can backfire easily, undermining trust in these systems for the future. Now, it's true that the Pension Outlook authors optimistically recommend that investments be made in members' best interest, and I appreciate this perspective, but I do remain concerned that politically driven investment rules will render the pension promise riskier and in turn undermine covered workers' retirement security. One interesting alternative mentioned in the Pension Outlook chapter is the development of pandemic bonds that can be used to support sectors or businesses when a sufficiently severe externally measured threshold is triggered. And these have been issued by some international organizations, and the European Commission is now seeking to issue over 900 billion euros worth to such an end. And third, last but perhaps more important than any of the other points mentioned above, we must remember that to ensure strong pensions, we must have strong and well-functioning labor markets. If workers are to be productive, men and women must be well-educated and skilled so they will earn enough to both support their families and save for retirement. They also need good health care so they can work longer and use these longer lives more effectively. So COVID has challenged many nations, including some of the most developed, and in my view, we have fallen short. It's good to be part of this discussion to go ahead, move ahead to fix global pensions on all these fronts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Olivia. I'm glad to hear those three main messages that pensions are here to provide retirement security, and it's important not to set precedents, and linked to that assets, yes, they can be used to invest in the best interest of members, but we have to be careful how they are used to support of the economy. Yes, we always try to balance the two sides of the coin. We take into account your concerns, and it's very important concerns. And the last point about the skills, healthcare, financial education, yes, labor markets, it's everything. And as we well know, in many countries, if labor markets don't function, there is a problem. And as the Secretary General and Greg highlights, one of the key risks going forward is that many people might not be able to save for retirement because they are not going to have jobs. So going on with the discussion, I have a few other questions that I would like to address. One of the issues that some of you have talked about is the issue of adequacy. There is a chapter that highlights this issue in the Pensions Outlook. And I would like to ask Helen, changing her hat from the president of the IOPS, the supervisors, to his deputy chair of APRA, the regulatory and supervisory body of Australia, and also what has been going on in Australia, but also I encourage Olivia, Eric to chip in. How do you see this idea of establishing a framework to assess adequacy, and what is the role of funded retirement savings in retirement saving adequacy? Eric referred a little bit on that. Helen?
Thanks again, Pablo. And as the Outlook outlines, adequacy is a complex issue, and it needs to be considered through a number of lenses, I think, and particularly taking into account the components of the system in a particular jurisdiction. It can also be considered at the system, the fund or the member level, and that makes actually having a framework and assessing adequacy and setting targets quite challenging. And I think the Outlook paper in Chapter 2 does provide a really useful framework for establishing and assessing adequacy, particularly at the system level, but obviously it needs to be applied quite differently in different jurisdictions, as the chapter notes. So Australia's retirement system broadly comprises three main pillars, which is common in many other jurisdictions. We've got a means-tested age pension, we've got a mandatory defined contribution pillar, and we've got a voluntary savings pillar. But as in many jurisdictions, there are also savings outside of the pension system, including home ownership, and there's access to other government support and benefits, and they also play a significant role in supporting standards of living in retirement. And so one of the fundamental questions and issues in Australia, as in other jurisdictions, is which elements of that do you consider when you're trying to assess adequacy as a whole, and for each of the elements in the different the pillars in the system. In practice in Australia, many individuals rely on a combination of all three pillars, receiving a full or partial age pension, having the mandatory pillar savings, and also having some voluntary contributions. The proportion of retirees that's fully reliant on the age pension has been decreasing, and that is because of the introduction of the mandatory pillar in 1992. And consistent with the sort of objectives of having a framework around adequacy, the broad objectives of that mandatory pillar were to lift adequacy of retirement incomes, to relieve pressure on the age pension, and to increase national savings. So it started at 3% of earnings as the contribution level, and it's gradually raised to its current level of 9.5%. Further increases are legislated with the rate planned to reach 12% in July 2025. But the need for and the timing of those future increases is currently the subject, yet again, of a lively debate in Australia, particularly in the context of the extended COVID recovery phase that lies ahead. There have been some steps taken in recent years to make more explicit the objective of this pension system, and in particular the funded private saving two pillars in Australia. And the Financial System Inquiry in 2014 recommended that the government legislate an objective for superannuation that was to provide income in retirement to substitute or supplement the age pension. But it's been difficult to achieve consensus on this objective or the issue of adequacy that might underpin that across the many stakeholders that have been quite vocal in the debate in Australia. The government did consult on a retirement income framework in 2016 and proposed a retirement covenant in 2018, but those proposals have not yet been finalised for a number of reasons, including other priorities that the government has had in those years, but also because of the challenges in getting consensus on what the objective should be and how you set an adequacy level that everyone can agree on. Most recently, in 2019, the government commissioned an independent retirement income review, which was a recommendation of an earlier report into the superannuation system by the Productivity Commission. And the purpose of that review was to establish a fact base on the current retirement income system, and among a number of other objectives was to identify and clarify the role of each pillar in supporting Australians through retirement. That report was submitted to the government in July, but it was only publicly released a couple of weeks ago. And so many are still digesting its over 600 pages. And it covered in a reasonable amount of detail the issue of adequacy. It concluded that the system is effective, sound, and its costs are broadly sustainable, but identified areas where it could be improved. And in particular, one of its observations was that a clear objective for the system, agreed by the Australian community through the government, was needed to guide policy, improve understanding, and provide a framework for assessing performance of the system. It's almost like they'd read the OECD's Outlook paper ahead of time. They actually suggested that an objective be developed around the goal of delivering adequate standards of living in retirement in an equitable, sustainable and cohesive way. And the report goes on to actually outline its view, or the panel that did the review's view, on what those key elements of that goal. So what would adequacy mean? What would equitable, sustainable and cohesive mean? I'm not going to go through all of that today. Obviously, I would recommend you all read the review to get more insights over your Christmas holiday, good beach reading or snow reading perhaps. It is a fact base. There are no recommendations, just observations, but it has reignited debate about a number of issues relevant to the Australian context, like what should be the level of mandatory contributions and what should access to retirement savings for other purposes like housing be. That the review is intended to underpin policy decisions for the system, which is ultimately a matter for government. At a more micro level in Australia, our primary focus as APRA is more in the here and now and more at the fund and member level. And our focus is on the adequacy of what trustees are delivering for their members within the current policy settings. And that's clearly influenced by the key decisions that trustees make at a fund level, particularly around investment performance and fees and charges, because they can have a significant effect on the end balances of members. And so in recent years, we've been devoting a lot of our energy and focus to lifting outcomes for members in these key areas through our Prudential framework, through our supervision work, and also through enhanced data and transparency. That will continue in the next 12 to 18 months with a particular focus on ensuring that those funds and products that are underperforming lift their performance, but also looking to, in essence, exit from the market the funds that appear unsustainable or unable to address their underperformance. So that's a bit of a quick snapshot, Pablo, of the Australian experience.
Quick and excellent, Helen. Thank you very much. I find interesting your comment on the importance of having clear objectives, but the difficulty within any society, I would say, of reaching a consensus of which those objectives should be. We have been struggling with this kind of discussions at the OECD Working Party on Private Pensions because obviously different jurisdictions have different objectives, but you are highlighting that even within jurisdiction, within countries, it's difficult to reach a consensus. May I ask any of the other speakers if they would like to say something about this issue, or I can move to other questions? Yes, Olivia, please.
Well, I see our time is growing short, and so I wanted to just highlight two other topics, if I may. One is that the Outlook doesn't say very much about the decumulation phase and the potential role for annuities. And so I know that's a topic that's near and dear to your heart, but I would love to see something like that in the next iteration. And the other topic you touched on, which I find quite fascinating, is what has been called in the US the sidecar account, which is basically a second account which workers can save for a rainy day in, which is separate from their pension. And the notion is that the pension would then be better protected if people run short on a rainy day. And I think those are very interesting. Many states in the US, something like 19 states, have already started mandatory defined contribution plans for workers that have no pensions. And they've constructed them so that people can take out the money if they need it without paying tax. So it really is a sidecar sort of a program. The problem now that they're facing is that with negative returns, very low returns or negative returns, and relatively high fees on these small accounts, these small accounts are not necessarily playing the role that had been hoped for them. So there are two things that I think we should be keeping our eye on as we go forward. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Olivia. Yes, we talk about these issues. They are very important. Yes, the payout phase is very dear to my heart, as you know, and as you say, and we continue working on the OECD on that. One of the chapters deals with these risk-sharing issues of longevity, which is linked to the payout phase. As you mentioned, we have, we have around 10-15 minutes before we finish. And I would like to put to the panelists an additional question, which I believe we touch different aspects in different chapters. The chapter on communication, on investment strategies, on defaults, and setting up default investment strategies, and the possibility and the importance of people switching pension funds in order to adjust their investment to the risk profile, but also as one of the main themes of the Outlook is everything has to be a balance between the different trade-offs, because there is nothing perfect. There are positive and negative consequences of the different choices, and balance this trade-off is quite important. But let me bring the question. So we have been arguing that having retirement saving arrangements or account balance retirement arrangements, it's important. And in these arrangements, people have to make choices. And we need to help people making choices, because we know from behavioral economics that sometimes people do not make choices, or they are not prepared to making choices. So we have always argued in the OECD roadmap for the good design of DC pension system and in previous pension outlooks that having defaults, it's important, because they don't prevent the choice, but they do try to address the issue that some people might not make a choice. So having a default that protects them, it is important. But the key question is, what are the issues can we, policymakers and regulators, and also the industry, put on the table to assist people in making those choices? Any of the speakers want to step in first? Eric?
So I guess I'll come in, because I fully agree it's a question about choice, but I think there are two choices that come up. One is the choice to participate in the program to begin with, and then once you're in these account-based systems, okay, what do you do? What's the next choice? What's your investment choice after that point? And I think they're both critical, because, again, looking from the U.S. perspective, first, the U.S. policymakers had to create incentives just to get people to participate in the programs. I mentioned already the role of tax incentives to make IRAs and 401ks, employer-sponsored pension plans, kind of more attractive for people to actually put money in there. And then later, we had in the Pension Protection Act of 2006, automatic 401k enrollments. So that's kind of tackling the first question, choosing to participate. And then what happens is, okay, once you're participating, how do we ensure that you're choosing to put your money into investments that are going to get you better returns? And here, I think this is a very difficult question. So, for example, if you look at something like the Pan-European Personal Pension Product, the PEP, one thing that kind of raises a concern is PEP says that you need to, as a default, be in a, quote, safe product. Now, if you're going to invest in a safe product, that's probably something that's going to be a very conservative investment and probably will not get the retiree the return that he or she needs over the course of their working life and when they finally retire. In the United States, when we talk about default 401k contributions, the default usually is some type of fund, usually a target dated fund, which is designed to over time, rebalance one's portfolio from a combination of equity and non-equity investments that ideally provides a better rate of return over the course of one's, working life. And so, these types of innovations, target funds, as well as informing workers about a variety of different investment options that kind of fits their willingness to take on financial risk, is going to be critical to making sure that these systems work.
Thank you, Eric. Well, Joyce.
Pablo?
Yes, Helen. I'm glad that you want to step in. I was going to ask you the view of the regulator supervisor. Please go.
Well, I think for us, the experience during the COVID period was quite interesting. And if there is a silver lining to come out of it, it is that many members are now actually much more engaged with their superannuation or pensions and trying to understand what they're invested in and how it behaves. And funds had quite different experience through this period in terms of levels of access to the early release scheme, the levels of switching, and the way they were able to communicate and engage with members was pretty key in mitigating some of the impacts of poor choices and poor decision. And, where the Chief Investment Officer did a regular video communicating to the members to sort of try and provide reassurance, for example, those funds had lower levels of switching or withdrawals than others. Funds that had good advice and members were able to access some advice about their situation and their choices and whether they should take early release or not. So I think from an industry point of view, those member engagement and member communication mechanisms are really important, and leveraging the attention that the super system or pension system has got through the COVID period and building on that going forward to better inform and engage and get members to make better informed, better investment choices, I think is going to be really important.
Thank you very much, Helen. Yes, we also have the experience when we were interacting with regulators and supervisors from different jurisdictions of the importance of communication between the managers of the asset pension funds and also members to follow the advice that the Secretary General has highlighted, that is stay the course, do not materialize those losses, and of course keep on with the long-term investment strategy that is important to build retirement savings tomorrow. I see that Olivia might want to add to the conversation. Please, Olivia.
A fascinating discussion. I think that communication is central, but the other side of the story is also financial literacy. In other words, the plan sponsors can be communicating all they wish, but if the participants are not imbued with the fundamental simple concepts of interest compounding, risk diversification, inflation, then it's potentially going to fall on deaf ears. Another concern that I would like to just interject briefly is that we've been doing some research lately on people's perceptions of their own longevity in the wake of COVID and how that's changing their willingness to save and annuitize at the point of retirement. And at least the early evidence seems to be showing that people are greatly underestimating their own longevity now, particularly because they've heard so much negative about COVID and how it's affecting older people's longevity. And the reality is, as you point out in Pensions Outlook, there is an impact, but it's not going to save all the pension systems in the world because of extremely high death rates among the elderly. And so I think we have to be very alert to some of the changes that are going on in people's minds regarding longevity expectations and what that means for pensions.
Olivia, I couldn't agree more, but I find very interesting the point you make that even though people before were already thinking that the longevity was not as high as the numbers So now they might even be thinking that will be lower. And some of the studies we have looked at, and we will be talking in the Working Party on Private Pension about recent trends on longevity. I think it's tomorrow we'll be talking about that. Well, that can bring more problems going forward because, as the Secretary General and Greg highlighted, aging is still there. And one of the components of aging is the increase in longevity. So I think we are getting close to the time that we had allotted. On the financial literacy, if anyone wants to say something, because this is, again, this trade-off between, yes, we need to communicate in a way that people understand, but also we have a problem that the level of knowledge and the financial literacy of many of the receptors of this information might not be up to the task. This is why we believe, and we always argue, and one of the chapters in the Pensions Outlook discusses on selecting investment strategies, how the regulator could select an investment strategies to address the problems brought about by the people that do not or cannot make a choice. So unless somebody wants to make a point, I'm going to thank all of you. But before anybody wants to say something in addition, we still have a few minutes, so please let me know. Helen?
Pablo, I mean, I think financial literacy is an issue, and sort of guided investment choice is important. But I would come back to the point about trust. And if you have an advisor that you trust, or if you trust your pension provider, then even if you don't necessarily fully understand the advice, if they communicate in a way that reassures you to not make a poor decision, then that in and of itself is going to be helpful.
Yes, institutional trust is extremely important. We have experienced that in many countries, but we have also seen that the trust in the pension system to deliver in the overall it is not too strong in many jurisdictions. But I agree that trust, if you trust the people or the institutions that are managing the assets, and also the regulators and policymakers that are designing and improving the system, is extremely important. And this brings in again the issue of communication, because you build trust by communicating in a way that people feel, okay, we understand what is going on, not perfectly, but yes, this trade-off, it's quite important. You, Olivia, would like to add something to that?
Well, so I think everyone is quite well aware of the situation in Chile, where there has been a defined contribution system for years and decades. And yet in the last 2 years, there's been a lot of protest against the mandatory system. And I think one of the reasons is exactly because people didn't understand the system. I did a survey probably about 4 years ago in Chile asking people, how do you think the benefits are structured? And the vast majority of the respondents said, basically, in so many words, it's a defined benefit system. It's based on your years of service and your age when you retire and your pay. And in fact, it was not. It has been a defined contribution system since 1981. And I think one of the results of not educating people about the nature of the program is that it renders the program extremely vulnerable to populist movements, as we have been seeing. So I understand that it's not easy to educate the participants, but I think really very little effort has been taken in many Latin American countries, and I would say in the US as well. Very few people begin to understand the Social Security system. I've been working on it for 40 years, and I still don't understand the 3,000 pages of detail. Greg, you had your hand up.
Greg?
Yeah, look, I was going to say, reflecting, I guess, on my previous role as chairman of the Australian Securities Commission, where we had a role in superannuation, I think, and financial literacy. I think, there's a lot, we've got a long way to go in financial literacy in this area. It also, high levels of disengagement by many is an enormous problem. And I do think still having default funds, as we have in Australia, a default investment strategy is still a very good thing. The right nudge, I'll call it. I think we are making progress. I'm sure, Helen, we are. But still a long way to go. And a lot of, as you say, a lot of still misunderstanding. And you need to have trust and confidence in the financial advice sector. I totally agree with Helen. We haven't been without issues in that sector in Australia. But again, from an international perspective, Eric, on IOSCO, I know for a long time we have set up a financial literacy group. Financial regulators, market regulators think that financial literacy is critical to allow people to make informed choices. So fully agree, actually, I think with everybody. So Eric, I don't know what you thought, but I think that's true, right?
No, I fully agree. In my former role, we always believed that financial literacy was critical. We invested a lot in financial literacy programs. ICI today has an investor education program, but it's hard. It's really hard, but we just got to keep on working at it.
Well, thank you very much. I couldn't agree more. And I think this is a perfect way of finishing, because as it was highlighted by the Secretary General and everybody, the main theme of the Pensions Outlook 2020 and the main theme of the work we do at the OECD is to make retirement savings arrangements more sustainable and also to make them more resilient, in particular, given the experience of, and as this discussion was showing, educating people about the nature of the program, the nature of the retirement saving arrangements in their own country. It's a key point to make them more resilient, because as Olivia said, if people don't understand how people are going to support a system they don't understand. So I couldn't agree more, and I'm happy to see that we didn't plan that, but we reached this end that brings in another issue on increasing the resilience of retirement saving system. And I just would like to thank all the speakers to participate, to thank all the people who has been listening through Zoom or through YouTube. And just to tell you that we will be back here in 2 years' time with a new pension outlook. But in the meantime, the OECD Secretariat, the people that have been making this pensions outlook possible, it's not me. There is a lot of people behind it. I'm just the face today, but there is a lot of people behind it that have done an incredible job, and I feel very honored to work with them. We will remain available to address any questions that everybody might have on the different issues and the different chapters of the pension outlook. Thank you very much, all of you, Greg, Olivia, Helen, Eric. It has been a pleasure to interact with you today, and thank you very much to everybody listening to us.
Thank you, Pablo.
Yeah, thank you, Pablo, and congratulations to you and the team. Well done. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye.
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 Well, this ends exactly at 9:15, the launch of the OECD Pensions Outlook. Thank you very much to everybody, and see you soon. And please remember that the entire team that has put out this pension outlook remain available.
Right, thank you.